So thank you, Klaus. And I would like at this time to invite our panelists who have presented back onto screen so we can begin our moderated discussion and questions and answers. I'd also like to encourage our audience to go ahead and submit any questions they hope to get answered today. We are also keeping track of all questions that you may have. And if we don't get to your answer today, we are going to be able to publicly, by posting on the RDCA-DAP website, you will be able to see a response to your question. And I have seen some really thoughtful questions come in. So I want to get started. I thought those were fabulous presentations and really showing how we went from planning, RDCA-DAP and what we've accomplished in a year, and to where we're going to go forward. And so I think we had some really great examples of a success story of something that wasn't even part of RDCA-DAP, but with the autodominant PKD example, I think is a really great example of what happens when we data share and pull together. And really, and what we can get out of that, a surrogate endpoint is such an important thing, and they're very hard to accomplish. So great work for that. So I want to get us started with some questions to our panelists, and I want to start with Vanessa. So Vanessa, I thought it was really great how we are now seeing IAM rare registries that are willing to contribute data to RDCA-DAP. How do you think that taking these early adopters into RDCA-DAP with those IAM rare registries, how can we take what we've learned once we've brought it into the platform to be able to help inform other registry developers into collecting optimized data?
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. I think just actually picking up on some of the themes that each of the panelists raised in their talks, but really underscoring that critical need for the foundational information and natural history data for rare conditions is like the importance of every single data point and the need for consensus really and thought around the right type of data to be collected in the right way and in the most appropriate way for the defined purpose. All of those considerations are so important. And then really thinking through a study design that is thoughtful and results in the rigorous collection of data with, appropriate permissions and ability to share data for different use cases, while also balancing the time and effort that's being asked of patients and families in order to participate. The value of that really can't be overlooked. And then really just being sensitive to the demands being placed on the rare disease community and thoughtful about providing guidance around best practices around data structure, data standards, ontology, unique identifiers for cross-study harmonization. All of these complex concepts, the more that we can communicate about those concepts in ways that are clear and implementable and accessible is really just going to improve the data coming from the community to begin with. So I think RDCA-DAP really offers an opportunity for us to bring data in, but also an opportunity for us to create some of these standard recommendations and put information out to the community in ways that are informative and accessible to those who are implementing studies in the community. So we can start to standardize some of that, some of those recommendations around data collection and study design as well.
Thank you, Vanessa. I think you really do highlight it really well about the need for data standardization, and which will really help as we start to bring more data in. If we can standardize it from the beginning, it takes away some of those challenges that Amanda brought up in her presentations about how do we pull in different data sources. And so, Amanda, I'm going to ask you next. You gave a really great analogy about card games. I've heard some comments, I saw some comments from even our panelists. We were messaging one another about such a great example of that. And so that is a challenge. That's a question that is asked a lot. Well, how do we handle all these different sources of data being pulled in? And how do we make it everything usable and user-friendly and we can get that important output? So you discussed, some of those challenges, but if you want to highlight anything additional to those challenges involved in curating and harmonization, the different types of data that we hope to be bringing into RDCA-DAP?
Well, so the curation and ingestion process is really different depending on the data paradigm. The work involved in curating and cleaning up data from an electronic health record is quite different from data from a clinical trial, for example. But I think probably the thing that we're most excited about is all of the work that we're doing, Michelle, to integrate annotation from ontologies. And there's a really strong focus on ontologies for rare diseases. So we're using the HUM, which is a combination of the human phenotype ontology along with the ordo ontology for rare diseases specifically, and some others like that help us to not just map and play the card game, not just solitaire, right, which is never going away. We'll be doing that. But when we annotate some of the semantic interpretations of the meaning of different data as it comes in the ingestion pipeline, what we're doing is giving the opportunity for a person to search across a hierarchy of ontological terms and find these data that are mapped to completely different standards. So they're able to sort of make their own analysis subset based on the annotation that we proscribe during the ingestion process. So that's the first thing, but I would just add one little note, which is that we're really hoping that this is continually and iteratively improved, meaning that we have our best guesses at some annotation as the data come in, but as people access data, we're hoping to, and this will be an evolutionary process, but we're hoping to build in the ability for users to suggest additional annotation or to make corrections to annotation that they perceive as incorrect.
Thanks, Amanda. I really like how you talked about that this is really this iterative process. And as we may have some assumptions going in, but as we receive more data, we're able to process and curate more data, we have more outputs coming in, we will be learning from this project and this initiative on how to optimize ourselves, the platform, with more data. So I really thank you for that as we think about this. And so I want to switch over to Pravin, because really the work in PKD really took the end point, the end game of we've data shared and we've curated it and we pulled together all of this data, and oh my gosh, we now have an endpoint that both the FDA and EMA supports. And so being part of that review, but also now being on our industry side and talking to your other colleagues in industry and even to our patient groups, because we need our patient data. Why is data sharing so important, and how could it be, that you were able to get a surrogate out of that, which is not necessarily a goal for every aspect of data sharing, because it takes a lot of time. But why is data sharing so valuable in the advancement of rare disease drug development?
Thank you. It's a really good question. I mean, if you actually think about rare disease, and hopefully I'll use this analogy in the right sense, we are almost looking for a needle in a haystack. And if I use a PKD as an example, the awareness, so we classify our patients into aware and unaware patients. And the lack of awareness actually runs up the chain. It starts with the patient themselves, because nobody actually thinks about they have this rare disease. And even in our healthcare setting, when you show up to a primary physician, that's not something they are looking at. When in the PKD sense, from what we know, you will get screened for blood pressure and you will get screened for proteinuria. But in their diagnosis, PKD will be much further along until they decide to get MRI. And as an example, what we have learned is women are more likely to get diagnosed of PKD over men. Guess why? Because they show up to an ultrasound for pregnancy in their early life, and when the physician looks at the scans and looks at the baby, oh, there is some other thing going on, and that's how it gets disease. So where I'm going with this is, by allowing data sharing and allowing different data sets being put together, allows us to better inform how to risk assess in healthcare setting, but more so than looking to do clinical trials to accelerate drug development, because FDA needs certain amount of data to make sure the drugs that we are bringing to the public are safe and effective. So it actually, the data sharing has much larger benefit to the community. And more, as I mentioned in my talk, I do personally believe that more so in a rare disease setting, because those data, if you keep keep those in silos are not good enough to make decision for one stakeholder. And I think that's where I see the benefit of this. This goes well beyond just nice to have to why does that matter?
No, I think it's a really great point. By bringing together all of that data, we can collectively learn from the greatness of it and the vast volume of data, instead of having individual data sets being looked at separately. We bring in more power almost by having more of these data sets. So I just want to remind our audience to please submit any questions you have for the question and answer. And I want to turn to Klaus. So taking what Pravin has just talked about the power of data sharing and what it can provide by pulling together single entities into a much larger project and initiative, what kind of tools do you envision that will be built from RDCA-DAP, and how will these meet the needs of the drug development community and regulators?
That's a great question, Michelle. And so you can think about those kinds of solutions in essentially two ways or two categories. One is where we can look at data from the standpoint of being able to characterize a disease. And so this is not yet like super sophisticated longitudinal modeling, but it still carries a sophistication in the way you have to structure and curate the data so that you can have a look at the characterization of a particular disease and what that means in the context of drug development. That is one. The other one has to do with longitudinal dynamics, right? Because that's what really matters for clinical trials, how things behave over time. And how things behave over time can take the form of biomarkers, even digital assessments, and through remote monitoring technologies that are being proposed as ways to address measurement gaps. And that, of course, in the era of COVID-19 becomes even more important, and more traditional COAs and patient-reported outcomes, really understanding the longitudinal dynamics of those measures. And again, it's all about the sources of variability and how you can identify and quantify those sources of variability in a manner that really becomes actionable to design clinical trials. I know that there's been methods to calculate sample sizes and calculate power since, I guess, the 19th century. But those measures are more or less static in time, and they don't necessarily account for longitudinal time-varying probabilities of attrition during a trial, impact of unforeseen circumstances like COVID-19, and other reasons for dropouts, et cetera. So those are the kinds of solutions that definitely can come out of the integration of data. But more importantly, the ability to look across diseases. And the importance of looking at common measures, and those, again, can be biomarkers, remote monitoring technologies, digital measures, and traditional COAs that can span multiple diseases in which the specific condition becomes another variable, another covariate in the model, and how you can start looking at the variability and response there. So yeah, it has endless possibilities, even from the quote unquote simple characterization of diseases at baseline.
Thanks, Klaus. I really appreciate that. And to Vanessa, Klaus just talked about how the tools that come out of RDCA-DAP help the drug development community and regulators. But what about our patients and our patient groups? Because they're an important stakeholder in all of this. Ultimately, they are the ones that we need to find our treatments for and look and develop trials and hope that they will enroll and be participants in. And so what can patients or patient groups, what are they going to get out of RDCA-DAP? What should they be looking for, and how this integrated data can be useful to them in the goal of advancing rare disease drug development?
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. I think that's, an important question. And I think for patient groups, one of the benefits of RDCA-DAP will be the ability to conduct those basic analyses. So, within combined data sets for a single rare disease, but then also the ability to explore common symptoms that may overlap across diseases or across disorders. So the idea that as we get to know more about one disease, we may be positioned to leverage that knowledge to better understand another. I think that's really intriguing. to the community. And then the idea of being good stewards of the data that they may be collecting and, utilizing and sharing the data to the fullest extent possible. And then ultimately being able to explore the answers to research questions with more statistical power is also, I think, a big motivator. So, ultimately being part of an initiative that moves rare disease research and drug development forward faster is a huge priority for the community. And I did just want to share that we have a series of videos that are coming out from some of our pilot groups, which will be available after the workshop today as part of the post-event communications and resources. So you'll be able to hear a bit directly from the community about what they think is most valuable about this initiative, how they're hoping to use it, what their sort of assessment of why this is such a high priority for the community really is. So I think they're quite powerful. And it's clear in the videos that RDCA-DAP really resonates with their mission and goals as well. So I hope you'll check those out.
Yeah, no, I think that's great, Vanessa, and I want to thank you. And, we've spent the last hour or so in our presentations really talking about, what we can do when we data share and some examples of what data can look like when we put it into a platform. But really, what is the incentive to data share? Why should the various different stakeholders, industry, patient groups, academia, why should they think about wanting to share their data? And so I'm going to start with Jane with that question about why should we share data and why is this so important?
Sure, it's a question we get all the time, and I think the answer is probably slightly different depending on what stakeholder group you are. I think for everybody, the value of sharing data is clearly in the fact that if you share your data and so do other people, we all get to use a bigger data set and have a more informed decision making and really understand each disease better. And that's common across every group. But if we take each of the other stakeholder groups one at a time, from the perspective of a patient group, sharing their data is really important because it will drive interest from industry, it will drive interest from regulators, everybody will understand the disease on a more global scale and really drive drug development forwards. And by making that data available, some company that has a drug that hits a particular pathway may decide to go forwards in that disease versus another just because they know how to run a trial and have access to data. So from the patient's group position, it's really valuable to have that data out there and available and visible to people so that people can use it and help move towards treatments and cures faster, which of course is the goal of most of the patient groups. And they can use the data themselves to understand their disease condition well. From the perspective of industry, I think it really comes down to getting enough data to really understand a disease condition and how biomarkers change, how outcome assessments change, and really be able to design informed trials, not just with their own data, but with other people's data as well, and learning from the experience of the whole community. In the case of failed trials, it may be very easy to share data because there's not much value anymore, but even in successful trials, there's always value in getting more and more data together. Then finally, for the academics, again, it really comes down to being able to use your data and other people's data, making that data available to drug developers, making it available to companies to make sure that their data is really used, can be published on and shared with the community and used by everyone, including yourself and your collaborators, to move your research forwards. I'm sure others could add to that.
So thanks, Jane. I'm going to start transitioning over into our question and answer time. And we've got a lot of really great questions that have come in. And I think for us who have been involved in the day-to-days of RDCA-DAP, I think that we already know how the importance of the type data that comes in and that we're looking for de-identified data and things of that nature. So I was wondering if Klaus, you could help us in reminding everyone about what we were looking for when we see data that comes in. Are we looking at de-identified data, who owns this data, and really that interfacing with access of data on that public side, because we do want to make this all publicly available.
Yeah, that's a great question, Michelle. So let me start with the first concept of data ownership. Data ownership it stays forever with the individual that participated in research. There's no ifs and buts about it. Ownership stays with the participant. Now, custodianship of the different sources, be it a registry, be it an observational study, be it a clinical trial, that stays with the organization that really holds the master file of the quote unquote raw data that contains personally identifiable information. That's the custodian, and with the custodian is with whom c-path executes data contribution agreements, and that is the legal document that governs any data transfer of patient-level data. One thing that is important to remember is that in the process of getting the data, quote-unquote, ready for transfer, there will be a component of ensuring that the data have been properly handled from the identification perspective to meet specific regulations. And I'm sure the GDPR question is going to come up, but that's a whole afternoon session that we can cover on that one. But making sure that the data are compliant with the appropriate regulations for data privacy. Then the data get transferred. The first thing that gets checked whenever we get a transfer of data is that the data have been properly handled from the identification perspective. Then comes the assessment of the data completeness, the data quality, the granularity of information, and then through the steps of starting with more of a data lake approach, where things may not necessarily be as structured, but still very valuable to get oriented as to what are in the data. And once a specific unmet need with a very specific solution has been identified, AKA the question you want to answer, then you move into a very focused data management approach to get the data to a quote unquote regulatory grade standard, so that you can build the solutions that are needed, and then put those solutions through the appropriate regulatory review mechanisms. Now, the tools, once the tools get endorsed through whatever regulatory mechanism by FDA or EMA, they become publicly available, regardless of any permissions of accessibility that the contributor may have set up for their data. So even at a standpoint where a company may put certain restrictions on the accessibility to their data, the fact remains that any solution built on those data will become publicly available. And that is a piece of the incentive for people to share data, that even if they put restrictions on the data accessibility, which can evolve over time, by the way, the outcomes, the tangible solutions all become publicly available. I'll stop with that, hoping that answered the question.
No, thanks, Claus.
Sorry,
Sure.
This is Amanda. I think one of the things that we haven't mentioned, which is certainly a value of sharing data, is that we at c-path do a lot of work to map and harmonize and standardize data. So many of our data contributors are happy to get their data in SDTM format, for example, because that accelerates their work. And it's extensive, the team of people that we have working on that. So I think that that's a real advantage. And then Vanessa and I have been working closely, our teams have been working closely on helping to give feedback to registries, so that it's really a continuous loop of building a registry and then applying standards and control terminologies and improving. So it's iterative, like we talked about. But I think that all of that work that we do to standardize and harmonize data is a real advantage for sharing data with us as well.
No, thank you, Amanda. And I actually want to turn to Pravin real quick about, after hearing what's been discussed by Klaus and Amanda, what are your thoughts with this? Because ultimately, as an industry member, there must be some thoughts about being able to see this outcome of some possible data that could help, again, accelerate this drug development. So do you have any thoughts on that from the industry side?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the case, again, I go back to the PKD. It could be a difference of decades between being able to bring a therapy to market or not. And if you look at actually PKD as an example, today, FDA accepts what's called accelerated approval, meaning you can bring drug to the market based on TKV, which is a shorter study, and then you can follow up with EGFR. That is an outcome you would agree that if we set as a group, as an objective for any other rare disease, that we need a pathway for streamlined access to therapy from pharma perspective, from patient perspective. will not be debatable. But if we were to say, there will be only a regular path to bring drug to the market, it will take decades because one company or silos will need to generate enough data. Then it is on agency to make sense of all these things coming, I would call bullets coming from all different angles, without having an independent body and say, is it making sense? Are we at that scientific rigor that we as a community stand behind this? It is an excellent discussion because from pharma standpoint, IP and legal will be front and center of this discussion. That's where I think we'll have to, I almost think, again, PKD is an example, go step by step. In PKD, the first thing was about patient identification. So all you're sharing is natural history data that came from NIH, came from Mayo Clinic, several other academic institutes, placebo data came from Otsuka. So one has to moderate the expectation and go maybe step-by-step approach to get there. But from industry point of view, I think, especially for rare disease, this could be difference of decades, whether one can reasonably bring a product to the market.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. And I'm going to combine two separate questions that were sent in from some of our audience members, but actually kind of complement each other very well. And so I'm going to start with Vanessa for the first half and then Jane for the second half. And then if anyone else wants to chime in, that's quite okay. So the first part is how is RDCA-DAP different than a registry? And that's going to be for Vanessa. But then following up with that for Jane is the question that RDCA-DAP is not only a data sharing and collaboration tool, but is it actually a data repository? So I'm going to start with Vanessa on the first part about how RDCA-DAP, is this a registry? Is it not a registry? And so what are your thoughts?
Yeah, thanks. And I'm happy to make this clarification for the audience. So RDCA-DAP is not actually collecting and generating new data. The sort of infrastructure that RDCA-DAP is really intended to harmonize different data sources and different data types. So the idea is really that there is this repository of data, rare disease data that exists. And if we can bring it all together in a central location and have these data sets complement each other, then we're bringing more power to the analysis that we can conduct on the data. So we're, building larger data sets, we're building complementary data sets, we're building multi-sourced data sets, all towards supporting, different data modeling that can occur. So that could be basic analytics, clinical trial simulations, disease progression models, things of that nature. So there's no direct data collection that's happening through RDCA-DAP, but the infrastructure itself is engaging with, different partners that are actually collecting that patient registry and natural history study data. And then, as collaborators, we're in a really good position to start to advise people on how they can better standardize their studies, better standardize their data, incorporate different ontologies and data standards to structure their data in ways that makes it more usable.
Thank you, Vanessa. And Jane, what is RDCA-DAP a data repository, in the sense of being beyond just data sharing and things of that nature?
Yeah, and that's a really good question. And it's one that we've really been thinking about as we've been developing the platform. So as Vanessa said, we're really not looking at generating new prospective data. Our goal is to bring in existing data that exists from all around the world, even as new data has been collected, and make it available. The c-path method through all of our previous projects is always to be essentially a repository where we get copies of the data and people can access and download and use copies of that data. And we're hoping a large amount of the data in RDCA-DAP will be in that format where we'll have a copy of the data, it'll be physically there, you'll be able to download it, you'll be able to use it. We've recognized that particularly under data privacy regulations in certain parts of the world, we may not be able to access all data in that format, and we're beginning to look at whether there'll be ways to gain federated access to that data. So we wouldn't have a physical copy of that data, but it would still be able to be searched and used and analyzed through the analytics platform. And we haven't fully developed the plans for that. Amanda's been spending a lot of her time working out how that might look and how we might still be able to, at some level, standardize data, but certainly search and analyze that data in addition to the data that we actually have a physical copy of in a repository that can be downloaded and used, say, for a regulatory submission to FDA. So I think the answer to that is really we're looking at both, but primarily our hope is to be a repository where the data actually is, so that it can be downloaded, used, submitted as part of a regulatory filing, and really used to move drug development forward. Maybe I'll ask Amanda if she wants to comment on that further.
I think probably the thing we haven't really touched on, Michelle, is that we also expect the RDCA-DAP, don't forget the analytics platform portion of the acronym, right? So we expect it to not just be a data lake and a data warehouse, like Klaus mentioned, but we also expect it to be a suite of analytics tools that really facilitate things like coming to our platform to look at all these diverse kinds of data and then build your own subset, using the analytics tools and the onboard tools, and bypassing all of the work of downloading 12 individual data sets and doing all of the standardization, and then, ultimately coming up with this small little bit of data that you've selected as part of your analytics subset. So the tools for building cohort builders, basically, but also analytics tools like R and Python and all of the things that people are using these days to analyze data. So those are important to point out as well. It's not just the data itself, it's data and tools.
Yeah, that's a great reminder, Amanda, that this is a all-encompassing project, just getting data in, but how can we really pull data together and be able to add that analytic aspect where we can actually now be able to see a just better description of a patient population, or a spread of maybe disease characteristics in that patient population. And so we're getting a question, and I know in the many meetings and public meetings I have attended this summer, this is a question that's been coming up a lot, and I'm going to save it for Amanda to start with her, but I'm sure both Klaus and Jane are may have some follow-up to it. But it really is reflecting the real world scenario that we're facing right now with COVID and clinical trials in the era of COVID and data collection. And so the question is really, will there be any modifications in these efforts to incorporate remote assessments given COVID and the other global challenges for in-person assessments? I think I know how I would answer this question, but I will turn it over to you first, Amanda, on thinkings on this, because it is really reflective of everyday world and real life for us right now as we are running our trials.
I will tell you, after 10 years of working in electronic healthcare record development, hospital information systems development, that's an incredibly challenging aspect of everything that we're doing. So just working with the traditional clinician office notes is challenging, and using natural language processing to harmonize and find semantic interoperability. Remote access, so telemedicine, basically, how are we going to take advantage of that? I think it really becomes about, and this is purely from my experience with telemedicine, I think that what I do is I go online and I check my physician's notes, because most of us have access to our own charts now, right? So I take a look at those physician's notes, and I think that these telemedicine visits are great in many ways, but what I have noticed is that the notes are pretty slim compared to when I'm in the office and everyone's taking my vitals and so forth. So I'm not going to predict that they will be no value, but I do expect that the return on investment will be considerably smaller than it is for other types of data. But certainly, my team have no interest in turning away any type of data. If we can find value in the data and it has rare disease patients, then certainly we'll go through the work. It's for me, Michelle, it's really about, is there value? Because if there's value, it doesn't matter how much work it takes to get it ready for analytics.
Right, and everyone is kind of wondering what's going to happen in the post-COVID landscape of clinical trials, where we have really shifted in some of our protocol development of these more remote assessments that are happening through a Zoom or some type of web-based way to capture, an assessment that would have happened in a clinic. But you're right, we don't want to turn down data, and it's still informative information that you're telling us. We're still getting that lived patient experience. So I don't know, Klaus or Jane, if you have anything else that you want to add?
Yeah, one quick one from my end. So for the quantitative medicine program at c-path, one of the key things, and of course you, when it's a advert, is like a broken record, many times talk about this. So one thing is moving the collection of the same type of scale to a remote or improved technological way of capturing the same type of information. That is one type of solution. But then there's the other type of solution, which is, okay, how can we address measuring gaps? And that takes the form of a triangulation approach, in which you need to start by first understanding what is clinically meaningful for patients at each stage of the disease continuum, then understanding if you have measurement gaps today in capturing that clinically meaningful set of aspects, and then what kind of solution you can develop to address that measurement gap. Is it a completely new scale? Maybe. Is it an electronic implementation of an existing scale? Maybe. Is it a better understanding of the quantitative dynamics of existing measures? Maybe. Is it a completely new kind of technology that takes care of that measurement? Maybe. But you need to understand that those triangulation aspects, because there is no one-size-fits-all answer for those types of questions. And the ability of having a platform that allows people to integrate those kinds of data is one that is of value. And then the other thing is that every formalized longitudinal modeling exercise that we take on, it's not just about understanding the longitudinal dynamics and the covariates. It's also about understanding attrition and understanding missingness of data and the impact of COVID or many other situations that are very practical from a clinical trial standpoint, and how that affects the trials. We're in the midst of doing something like that very actively right now, based on a series of endorsed quantitative solutions that we have in Alzheimer's disease, where we're working on really providing a meaningful and actionable set of plans for how the trials are being affected, how to solve those in the era of COVID. And that's easily translatable, even though it's a non-rare disease and it's in old people, and we're talking about rare diseases, most likely with a huge pediatric population. The concepts are translatable, and that's one of the things that RDCA will benefit from.
Well, thank you, Klaus, for that. And I'm going to give one quick last question. I would say this is going to be for Jane, and I'm going to give you 30 seconds. And at the same time, I'm putting no pressure onto our critical path colleagues with this question, but there are numerous questions from our audience coming in about when do we think the analytics platform side is expected to be available for our researchers and for outside users to that. So Jane, if you could maybe answer that in a couple seconds, that would be great.
Sure. It's going to be an indefinite answer and a couple of questions. So by early 2021, we expect the first version of the analytics platform to be up and running. Now, bear in mind, we'll have limited numbers of data sets and limited amounts of data in that. And this will be a very early version, which we will anticipate those first users to be providing us a lot of feedback about what they want, what they need, so that we can then improve it. So that'll be a very early version, rarely as a test case. And by the middle of the year, we hope to have a more final version up and going. I say more final because it will never be final. We'll always be improving. We'll always be adding data. And that will go on forever, I hope. But we hope to have the first version up early 2021 for test users. And then by later in the year, certainly by mid-year, hopefully end of Q1 for more general use.
Well, thank you, Jane. I want to thank the presenters for some great presentations, and to our audience for the questions you sent in. I had more questions than time. We will try to get all of your questions answered and have them posted on the RDCA-DAP website in the near future. So again, thank you, everyone.